What happens now with the Latin Mass movement under Pope Leo? So some people say, for example, with the Summorum Pontificum pilgrimage, that it's just a bone, it's a scrap, it's one step, forward and two steps back. And I would say, as someone who's been a traditional Catholic all my life, that compared to what was happening, like say, for example, in the mid-1970s, this has been 10 steps forward and one step back. And if anybody wanted any proof of that, just look at what happened in Rome this weekend, where you had a cardinal, Cardinal Burke, one of the most powerful cardinals in the church, in the Pope's own church, his own basilica, offering the traditional Latin Mass with permission from Pope Leo. So it seems to me that that's precisely what we wanted to see, what was going to happen, if there was any hope, if there was any chance that something good could happen in God's providence. We wanted to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And so now we've seen, I think, that paid off. So people say, have you changed your position on Leo? Absolutely not. I didn't expect much to begin with, other than, okay, Holy Father, you say you want to listen. You say you want unity. Are you ready for this? Are you ready to continue to allow the rightful liturgical aspirations of the traditional Catholics throughout the world? A huge number of people now. And I think what we just saw is not so much the human machinations or the strategy working, so much as we saw providence in what just happened in a lot of ways.
Why is the Latin Mass such a big deal then? Because it's just the one Mass.
Okay, so if you see what's happened, the progress that's been made, none of this makes much sense. People have been pointing out a lot, especially during this pilgrimage, how young it is. It's a youth movement. It's like World Youth Day with Tradcat, Latin Masses. Why is it appealing to the youth like it is? Everybody's talking about that. Do you know what this King Charles guy said when he saw the Latin Mass at the Brompton Oratory? He said, I can't believe how young it is. It's just the diversity, and it's young people. Even that guy, it was sort of struck by this. This is a surprise to modernists and to globalists when they see that. So you take, for example, we can show clips. I mean, we'll do that. Have Walter throw it up on the screen. You have, for example, guys like Harrison Butker, football player, Michael Knowles, people like that, who are saying things about the Latin Mass. And the reason it's relevant is because these aren't our allies. These are not cradle traditional Catholics. What explains a Harrison Butker? Let's just use him for a moment. First, we'll play the clip.
For the lead. Butker up, got it!
What is it you get out of the Latin Mass?
It's opened my eyes to the tradition of the faith, with St. Augustine, with Thomas Aquinas, with all of these great saints, and then seeing that this Mass of the Roman Rite, the Latin Mass, has been the Mass for the past 1,500 years that all these great saints went to. They were saying the same Latin prayers. It's just very beautiful. I feel very united.
Okay, what explains that? What happened there? Did someone make a full court press to get Harrison Butker to become No, Harrison Butker simply was exposed to the traditional Latin Mass. And he's a person who's in pretty substantial cultural influence. What happened? He went to the Latin Mass. And this is why we're saying the traditional Latin Mass is so important, because if people are exposed to it, people will finally understand, oh, I see what Catholicism is truly all about. And this has been the effort of the modernists from the beginning, was to destroy the church. Let's go back further. It was the effort of the Protestants, the Reformers, Thomas Cranmer, people like that. What did they do first? They went after the Latin Mass. That's what they went after. Why? Lex orandi, lex credendi. We say it like a broken record. How you pray is how you believe, right? So when we say it's the Mass that matters, that's an historical statement, first of all. This was the battle cry of the Catholics of the Western Rising in England under Edward IV, right after Henry. The war against the Mass was still in full force in England. And what do the Catholics do at that point? What do the traditional Catholics do at that point? They say it's the Mass that matters, right? And they're shouting that out in Cornwall and Devon, right? And they specifically said, we will have the Latin Mass. We'll have the Mass in Latin. And they died with those words on their lips. Why? Because they knew they're not academics. They're not intellectuals necessarily. They're the simple people. And they knew that if you teach your children the faith, the Latin Mass, you teach them how to behave at the Latin Mass, when to genuflect, why you genuflect, why the priest does this, why he does this, why we're on our knees, why is the priest facing away from us, why the Latin, right? If you teach a child this, he will have the faith ingrained in him so deeply he will die for it. This is the thing when people say it's just the Mass. It's just the Mass. The Mass is the greatest catechism in the history of Christendom. The Mass built Western civilization. It's the greatest sermon ever preached. And every child can see that. When you teach a child why you're going to the Mass, what the Mass means, he becomes a doctrinally solid, sound Catholic. To the point, as Cardinal Berg just said the other day in this Basilica when he said the Latin Mass during his sermon, he said, think of all the people down through the ages of time who have died for the faith that was instilled in them through the Mass.
Participate in the holy sacrifice of the Mass today, we cannot help but think of the faithful who throughout the Christian centuries have encountered our Lord and deepened their life in Him through this venerable form of the Roman Rite. Many were inspired to practice heroic sanctity, even unto martyrdom.
So as traditional Catholics, we have to understand, if there's a hope this big that it might be somewhere here or there in the world, the Mass will come back, we have to take time to seize on that opportunity, to occupy that space, to understand that the Mass built Western civilization. The Mass saved Christendom. It saved the children of light from the Muslims, from the Moors, from the heretics, all the way down the line. And it will save us. It will restore the Church. It will be the counter-revolutionary force such as the revolution cannot deal with. It's the Mass, and it does it automatically. You see what I mean? The traditional Latin Mass transforms, as I say, children, young people, all of us, into counter-revolutionaries, even if we don't know it. Michael Knowles, Harrison Butker, they would not say, I am a traditional Catholic counter-revolutionary. No, they wouldn't say that. They're just, I'm a Latin Mass guy. I love the Latin Mass. And guess what that does? That transforms them automatically into a counter-revolutionary, even though they don't want it, even though they don't even know that's what they are. That's what this revolution has been terrified of. So there are some people who understand this, what it is. The modernists understand it. The Protestants, 500 years ago, understood the power of the Mass. Pope Francis understood the power of the Mass. So he wasn't actually worried about ideological indoctrination going on among traditional Catholics. You know what he was worried about? You know what the modernists have always worried about? Simple, faithful fidelity. Catholic faith in children, in families, exercising immense influence on society and on these New World Order experiments automatically, without having to recruit academics and intellectuals and strategists from all over the world to teach people how to be counter-revolutionaries. The faith is counter-revolutionary. The Catholic faith, the traditional Catholic faith of our fathers, is the greatest counter-revolutionary force on earth. The modernists know it, the media know it, obviously, and sometimes I wonder if traditional Catholics fully understand that. That's the threat. The threat is your faithful fidelity to the faith of our fathers, which is embodied, defended, and strengthened and defended, obviously, in the Mass.
Yeah, I don't think they know it. It almost makes it better that way, though.
It does. That's the problem.
So, for this Mass, there's been some things, I know the AP reported it. How many actually showed up?
You want to know the answer to that? Check the press. Check the media. And this is why we supported it as strong as we did for the last few weeks, especially, but months, supporting the Summorum Pontificum pilgrimage, because if this could become an event that was significant enough to make a worldwide story, which is exactly what happened. So you say, how many showed up? Well, I think I guesstimated 5,000, between 35 and 5,000. The Associated Press said thousands. The Times, I don't know what they said. They said hundreds. They said hundreds. AP, yeah. Washington Times, I think, also said thousands. But the point is, the media showed up, and that's a huge sign of providence, I think. And it also, as I just said, the media are among those who understand. This is huge. Imagine yourself as a secular media person or a Catholic media person, and you're like, what is going on? What is with this ongoing back and forth civil war in the Catholic Church over what? Over the Mass. What is it? And that becomes a big story. So when I was in the back of the Basilica the other day and I saw something was going on, something was happening, because we hadn't expected that many. We had hoped, we prayed for it. I was so grateful to this audience for saying, come on guys, go out and pray for it, make this big. And wouldn't you know it, they showed up, the traditional show, and they showed up with docility and beautiful charity, humility, and that's also a story. They weren't out there shouting and screaming in the streets. They came up and took a stand by getting on their knees for the Latin Mass, and that every camera is going to go in. I saw them. I saw members of the press looking for the little children lying down, or the beautiful mother with a baby in her arms, you know. And so you could see it. They recorded it. It became a story, and that's why we were there. So when I saw this overcrowding beginning to happen in the Basilica, I saw the press suddenly run in, the big-time Vatican media run in. I ran with them to the front, and then we all watched as they trained those cameras on Cardinal Burke offering the Latin Mass. It came back. And why did it come back? It came back because it matters. And so that's exactly what we were all hoping and praying for. So what did the media get to see? What did they see? What did they show the world? Things that the world needs to see right now. For example, 5,000 young people receiving Holy Communion on the tongue. And we got to remember that during the walk itself, I was struck. I was so struck. I felt like an old guy on the pilgrimage walk itself to the Basilica. I'm looking around. Where are all the old people? Where are the people my age? There weren't any. Everybody was young. Everybody, it was like a World Youth Day of traditional Latin Mass people. And so then when that, again, attracted the attention of me, they went inside. What do they get to see next? They get to see the consecration. Now that's an incredibly important moment that we know theologically. It's also a very interesting moment from the point of view of media. What's he doing? Why is the cardinal turning his back on the people? Why, when people can't even see what he's doing up there? Well, that's because it's the whole mystery and sacrality of the traditional Latin Mass on beautiful, sublime display, most poignantly during the consecration. So they got to see this. Something that the press and everyone, I mean, I had tears in my eyes, of course, and the press really seemed interested in also was the thunderous singing of the Christus Vincit that happened in the Basilica of St. Peter as the Mass was ending. And to see Cardinal Burke up there sing Christus Vincit, Christus Regna, Christus Imperat, you know, the cameras were right in on that, because what is that? That's Christ the King. That's the proclamation of the kingship of Christ, that he will reign, that he commands us to do something in this world in order to save our souls and in order to benefit society. So they see that, the Christus Vincit. Let's just have a few moments of that. It was unbelievable. Now this is a really a beautiful moment, because you'll remember the dubia cardinals, the quote-unquote dubia cardinals, which basically just meant you had four powerful princes of the church who came together and said to Pope Francis, we question you. Now you got to remember, we're not bloggers, this isn't YouTube, right? In asking those questions at that level, that's already a correction. Everybody knew that. Mm-hmm. And so you had these beautiful princes of the church who, in charity and with respect for the Holy Father, went to him and said, you need to answer these questions. And he never did. That's almost irrelevant now, because we all know why they asked the question, because and why he didn't answer for the same reason. Yeah, exactly. So in doing that, and they suffered a great deal for that. They were maligned. They were stripped of their positions. They were threatened to lose their homes here, their apartments here in the Vatican even.
2 of them died.
2 of them died, yeah.
While waiting?
While waiting. They had that moment then when Cardinal Burke comes down and meets Cardinal Brandmuller right there, and they have this. He'd been there the whole time, and to see the traditional Latin Mass come back to the Basilica of St. Peter, and in the course of that, the dubia cardinals, the 2 surviving dubia cardinals, to be able to have this chance to meet was very poignant, and that was again the justice of Almighty God at work. Out of nowhere, no one had pre-announced it. It wasn't on the schedule. Cardinal Simoni gets suddenly kind of walked out. He'd been there the whole time. He'd been at the Mass the entire time, and I didn't recognize him. So I was looking at him like, who is this cardinal? I wonder. So here he goes up to the pulpit, and at 97 years of age begins to do a prayer. And I was listening because he's from Albania. He's got a very thick accent. And then it was only afterwards that we learned a little bit more about this man. He had been arrested in Albania for having said, this is back in the early 60s. When it was communist. Yeah, communist Albania, the communist government arrested him for what? For saying the traditional Latin Mass on Christmas Eve, the illegal, Mass. And so he spends 20 years, he was sentenced to death. Mm-hmm. He spent 20 years in prison or whatever it was, and then hard labor, and then while he was in prison, he was tortured, worked in sewers, just went through everything. And while he was in prison, he had committed the traditional Latin Mass to memory. So he's able to offer the Mass for his fellow prisoners. He's able to hear their confession. It's like a Walter Sissek story or a Cardinal Manzenti's story, And so then he develops this. He sees the face of evil up close and in person for most of his career. And then he develops this attitude or this idea that he wanted to do exorcisms. He wanted to really challenge, he's a trained exorcist, challenge the devil in his own game. And so it was just unbelievable to see at this particular Mass. Remember, keep in mind that Leo the 14th said that he named him, he chose to be his name as a successor of Leo the 13th, to see this exorcist come out and pray the prayer of exorcism, which was written by Pope Leo XIII in 1890 or something, at this very strange story, this very unusual story, but very credible story of Pope Leo XIII having just finished Mass, and he becomes aware of a conversation. He doesn't have a vision, but he becomes aware of a conversation between God and the devil, talking about the devil wanting to destroy the church. And in terms of a chastisement, he hears the voice of God say, you say you can destroy the church in 100 years, we'll give you 100 years. And so this is very mysterious, it's hard to understand how, in God's providence, how this came to be, but this is all that the Pope saw, Pope Leo heard was this happening. He becomes extremely concerned about the impact of the satanic in the church, against souls, and dedicates himself to writing prayers of exorcism, specifically the long form of the prayer to St. Michael, which is an exorcism. And then Leo has every Mass, every low Mass throughout all of Christendom, throughout all the church, was instructed to say what they call the Leonine prayers, including that prayer to St. Michael, the exorcism, after every single low Mass, because he was so concerned about the devil, right? Later on, of course, after the council, the Leonine prayers are just thrown out, of course, like everything else. They stop praying the prayer to St. Michael. You know, strange stories of Cardinal Supich, for some reason, saying he didn't want the prayer to St. Michael prayer, was making the liturgy too long. He didn't want it to be said after any Mass in his archdiocese. And what do? You have free reign of the devil against the church. The church is being destroyed, right? The human element is being destroyed. And so then to have Cardinal Simoni then at this particular event, for some reason to be invited, and he's out there with his hands extended, praying that exorcism in the Basilica of St. Peter after some of the things that have happened. We all know what's happened here that rises to the level of a complete scandal, the abomination of desolation recently. This is what that looked like. And the important thing to remember then is all of this is caught. The cameras are lined up on both sides of the altar of the chair sanctuary by the media, recording every single moment of this, including the exorcism. And as I say, there were people there that really have a keen interest and a huge reputation. For example, Nicole Winfield was there. Okay. Nicole Winfield's from the AP. Now, this is very significant. The AP, whenever the AP does a story, especially Nicole Winfield on a religious issue, you'll see the same story picked up by websites all across the country, right? That's just the way it works. If they're syndicated, if they're signed up, if you will, for the AP, that story goes everywhere. So it's significant. I want to read it to you. Here's just a little portion of what Nicole Winfield very fairly wrote, which again is why we supported the Summorum Pontificum pilgrimage, hoping this kind of reportage was going to happen. She says, the latest rounds in the liturgy wars date back to the Second Vatican Council. So right there you see that she gets it. Everybody gets it. It goes back to the Second Vatican Council. It is all about the Mass that matters. Yep. And she says, the 1960s meeting that modernized the church. Among the reforms was the celebration of the Mass in the vernacular rather than Latin. She gets it. She absolutely gets it. In the decades that followed, the old Latin Mass was still available but not widespread. In 2007, Pope Benedict XVI relaxed restrictions on celebrating it as part of his overall outreach to the traditionalists, still attached to the old rite. In one of the most controversial acts of his pontificate, Pope Francis in 2021 reversed Benedict's 2007 reform and reinstated restrictions on celebrating the old Mass. Francis said its spread had become a source of division in the church and been exploited by Catholics opposed to Vatican II. If I can break for a second from Nicole Winfield, this is nonsense. If you poll any parish, any congregation that goes to the Latin Mass in the United States, in Europe, wherever, about the Second Vatican Council, I guarantee you 95% of those people will not have read the documents of Vatican II. They don't know how many there were. They don't care about Vatican II because it was the Woodstock of that generation, the previous generation. It isn't that interesting. What Francis is actually talking about here is fidelity and return to the traditional practice of the faith, which looks divisive only to the modernist mind that's trying to completely reset the Catholic Church.
On that divisive thing is pretty funny.
Exactly. So she goes on, she says, rather than heal the divisions, and she's talking about Francis, this is Nicole Winfield, rather than heal the divisions, though, Francis's crackdown seemed to further drive a wedge. Indeed, because why? Because it's the Mass that matters. She goes on, Leo, history's first American Pope, was elected with a broad consensus among cardinals, and he has said that his aim is unity and reconciliation in the Church, which is what we were just talking about. Many conservatives, says Nicole Winfield, and traditionalists urged him to heal the liturgical divisions that spread over the Latin Mass especially. And this is what we were saying at the time of the conclave. We knew it because we talked to them. There were cardinals here who were making the Latin Mass an issue. Leo, very soon after he became Pope, was already addressing the Latin Mass issue. Why? Because the Latin Mass matters more than anything else, right? So that's Nicole Winfield. She specifically says, over the Latin Mass especially. That's the point. That's why we were here. That's why we promoted this thing, because it's all about this still. This is still the epicenter of the revolution. So again, this is what we're getting at then, that everyone seems to know this. As I say, Francis knew it, the modernists knew it, the Protestants knew it, 500 years ago.
The media know it.
The media know it, but you got to wonder sometimes if the traditionalists fully are aware of it. And in a way, that's a good thing, because then they're not the ideologues or rigid ideologue counter-revolutionaries that Francis wants them to be. They are just Catholics practicing the faith of their fathers, and that makes them counter-revolutionaries, whether they know it or not. Mm-hmm. But wait, there's more. It's not just media, it's not just hundreds of priests, it's not just cardinals and exorcists and priests and 5,000 people and families. There are politicians there as well. So Nicole Winfield noticed this as well, which is, again, why it's so significant. Nicole Winfield writes, the Hungarian ambassador to the Holy See, Edward Habsburg, stood for over an hour with his family among the pilgrims who crossed through the basilica's holy door, and then found spots in the standing room only section of the Latin Mass. Standing room only section for the Latin Mass. It's really nothing like the cliches you hear of traditionalists, says Edward Habsburg, the Hungarian ambassador. As he inched, according to Nicole, as he inched his way into the basilica, the reality is families with children, right? He's talking about what he sees, all these families, as he inches his way into this overpacked basilica. And wouldn't you know it, the next day, who visits the Vatican but Viktor Orban from Hungary, one of the most obviously conservative, probably the best, at an official state meeting, meets with Edward Habsburg, the Hungarian ambassador, and I wonder what they talked about. I can guarantee you that the traditional Latin Mass returning to the Basilica of St. Peter came up, if nothing else, over coffee after lunch.
Because
it's the Mass, and not just Europeans, of course, because this kind of, we really saw a signal or a sign that it's the Mass that matters in very unlikely places in politics in our own country, when J.D. Vance, out of nowhere, while running for vice president, brings it up.
You know, one of the things that I'm just not totally sure how to deal with as a public figure who sometimes does disagree and agree too with the Holy Father on some core issues is, what is my role, especially as a new Catholic, a Catholic that has some public voice? Like, what should I do when, for example, the Pope issues an order on the Latin Mass that I think is not the right order for the Church? Even though I'm not a big Latin Mass guy, that things like that felt a little bit. It felt wrong, right? I'll not go further than that.
Okay, so this is like, if you can give us a sort of like overview, like what's the last since Protestantism, I guess, all the different attacks on the Latin Mass versus the people trying to protect it.
Well, I mean, this has been another part of the traditional Catholic body of thought for a long time, and Michael Davies famously wrote Cranmer's Godly Order, for example, drawing parallels between Cranmer's table, the prayer service and stuff that they set up, with Bugnini's reforms and what happened to the Latin Mass. It goes back, obviously, to the Reformation period, but also Protestant, as that is unfolding, then probably the greatest, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but in my opinion, the greatest pope in the history of Christendom after Peter, I suppose you would have to say it's Pius V. In my opinion, it's St. Pope Pius V. He recognizes the advance of the devil on the liturgy specifically. So what does he do? He codifies the traditional Latin Mass. This is
Protestantism's effect on the liturgy.
exactly. So he's so concerned about the Protestant revolt that's happening and the advances that are made against the church, and again specifically the wars of liturgy, that he codifies it. And he says actually has a bull, quo primum, which says now and forever, in perpetuity, no one can change this Mass. Don't change this Mass. You cannot change this Latin Mass. Why? Because he knew if they started tinkering with it, if they changed it, if it was the greatest, the strongest, the most powerful bulwark against Protestantism, against heresy in Christendom, he knew it. And so he carves it into stone, if you will, knowing what was coming if anything happened to that Latin Mass. And that's been the case all along. So modernists come along. Well, modernist is just another sort of iteration of the Protestant heresy. Bugnini, Annibale Bugnini comes along. He starts tinkering with everything. He wants to tinker with the Rosary that was also codified by Pope Pius V after, during the Council of Trent times. And then, of course, moving forward, even Pius XII, whom we all love very much, even he was influenced by Monsignor Bugnini at the time to start tinkering with the Holy Week liturgies, right? The beginning, the slippery slope. I don't think he ever intended that, but that, of course, is part of the historical record. They've been moving against the Mass. So the same guy who convinced Pope Pius XII to start, maybe making the Holy Weeks a little shorter, the liturgies a little shorter, a little bit more easy. He, later on, is the one who has a huge influence on Pope Paul VI's pontificate, changes the Mass, gives us a new Mass, a Novus Ordo, a new Mass, and was suspect of Freemasonry to such an extent that he's banished by Paul VI himself. It became so obvious, like, oh, wow, this guy is a little bit controversial, he's a hot potato. Paul VI banishes him to Iran or something under suspicion of Freemasonry. You see, and it was over the Mass. He's called the father of the new Mass, and somebody pointed this out. Walter, you pointed this out today. If you don't think the Latin Mass is all that important, okay, fine, let's rethink it then. Think about what's happened since the Mass has been watered down, and so you end up with this Novus Ordo, the new Mass, which now is just off the charts with guitars and felt banners and nothing that was ever called for by Vatican II. But there you have it, this sort of what had been banalized liturgy, as Benedict referred to it. What happened then when the traditional Latin Mass was abrogated? You see this massive falling off from the faith. You see this massive closing of all the churches. You see Pope Benedict himself talking about seminaries closing, monasteries closing, and the liturgy becoming banalized.
This council created many calamities, so many problems, so much misery in reality. Seminaries closed, convents closed, the liturgy was banalized. And the true.
So then look at the power of the new Mass to cause people to move away from the faith, and then say, well, what would be the opposite of that? Oh, it's the traditional Latin Mass, which when it was introduced, every single time that it was,
and when it was freed.
Yeah, when it was freed, most dramatically by Summorum Pontificum, you see this massive return to the traditional faith, the doctrinal integrity of the traditional faith, as is evidenced by a guy, once again, like Harrison Butker, these other men that we mentioned, Michael Knowles, Matt Walsh, all these people in pretty influential position in the States who encountered it, realized that's the real thing, that's what they want for themselves and their children, and become traditional Catholics. What's it?
It does it to prelates too, because Cardinal Burke was influenced by it.
Oh, absolutely. Cardinal Burke said during his sermon, he said, we can't forget that there are a number of people, he's talking about himself, for whom, as young people, when they were exposed to traditional Latin Mass, it was the traditional Latin Mass that gave them the grace and the Catholicity to hear their own vocation to the priesthood.
Those of us who are old enough to have grown up worshiping God according to the usus antiqua cannot help but consider how it inspired us to keep our gaze fixed upon Jesus, especially in responding to our vocation in life.
So you see this constant, on the part of the modernists, this constant chipping away at the Latin Mass, because it was so powerful, it was so strong, it took a long time. So you have the Mass of 1962, I think they call that the John the 23rd Mass, where there was like the introduction of St. Joseph to the canon or whatever, just little tiny things that seem so harmless. And then you have the 1965 Mass, which is like a hybrid, some sort of a reform type Mass. And then, of course, 1969, they just come out with a new Mass, a Novus Ordo, and they say the old one was abrogated, which Benedict later said that's not true. It was never abrogated. So they first watered it down. All the way through the 20th century, they were watering it down. And then in 1969, they just used raw power. raw obedience. You must obey. You will now go to the new Mass whether you like it or not, and the old one is abrogated. This is the extent to which modernists feel that the traditional Latin Mass, lex orandi, lex credendi, if they pray like that, they're going to believe like that, and we will get nowhere with our brotherhood of man and our great ecumenical enterprise.
What do you mean when you say that the Latin Mass informs and influences other forms of worship?
Well, that's always been part of my polemic, because I'm always kind of concerned that people who are either new to tradition or they're just looking on, they realize there's something wrong in the church and they're looking on. And to interrupt myself, there are so many thousands, tens of thousands of really good priests in the church, that work in the church today, who may not be offering the Latin Mass yet, but many of them are disposed to it, they're interested in it, they come to our conferences and they want to have conversations. And I'm always really eager to let people know that we're not at all trying to push that away. Those people are all coming in the same direction as we are. We're all trying to figure this thing out together in the middle of a revolution. All those priests, I always say, fathers, hang in there. You're tradition-minded, and that's an ally for me. We're all working and figuring this out. So when I say that, the traditional Latin Mass is important for everyone, not just those who happen to understand it or who attend it or who are able to, because let's face it, a lot of people just don't have it. This is still an incredibly relevant, this event is relevant to them. The traditional Latin Mass is relevant to them because why? Because it informs authentic Catholicism, it informs all liturgy, it informs the new Mass. This is something that Pope Benedict XVI was very clear about. He said there's he called it mutual enrichment, and that was controversial because I don't believe the traditional Mass is enriched by the new Mass. But I'll take his point that the traditional Mass, the existence of the traditional Mass in the church, in a diocese, will enrich the new Mass, and that's incredibly important. You have this example in the center of this is what Francis was worried about. That's why he went after diocesan priests the diocesan masses. If you have that set up in any diocese or in every diocese or in many dioceses, now everybody has an example. They have the ultimate high watermark. Like, okay, this is where Catholic liturgy used to be. This is what it looked like. This is how priests used to dress in cassocks, and this is the old catechism. You have that example for people who, in the middle of a revolution, to sort of orient themselves. Sister Lucia talked about diabolical disorientation. We're all diabolically disoriented to a degree. The traditional Latin Mass helps everybody, not just traditionalists, but everyone kind of go orient back to what the Mass is all about, what the faith is all about, what we're on this earth for, why we're here in the first place. So I would say I would agree with Benedict, even though Benedict was not a traditionalist. I would agree that just freeing the Latin Mass is good, not just for traditionalists, but for everyone, because it will help every priest in the world see what authentic traditional liturgy looks like and try to move in that direction, which is what we all want.
Does it even depend on their personal holiness?
That's the beauty of it. It does not, and that's another point because that I think we really need to make. I grew up Catholic family, going to Catholic school, and I remember being surprised when I was a kid when Sister would tell us that the personal holiness of the priest, it's not everything dependent on the personal holiness of the priest. Some pretty lax guys have been priests in the history.
They can even be in mortal sin.
They can be in mortal sin and still say still say the Mass, under the condition that they go to confession right afterwards. But in other words, the holiness of the priest doesn't matter. I mean, isn't key to this, isn't dependent on his holiness, and his personality is not dependent. So that's why, for example, you see that the priests at the altar of the Latin Mass literally turn around. It doesn't have everything to do with him. He's simply leading us as a consecrated priest. He consecrates the bread and wine, and this is the worship, the proper worship that we need to give to Almighty God. The Latin Mass is greater than the priests who say it, and that's really important. The greatest sermon ever preached, the most powerful catechism in the world. And so this would be something to talk about our strategy from the conclave moving forward to now. We're not looking for the Pope to come and sort of become a traditionalist and then everything's going to be fine. If the Pope, even if a Pope is diabolically disoriented, if the Pope will have enough pastoral solicitude to free this Mass, we know what happens. The children of light will do the rest, just as we did after the Indult and after Summorum Pontificum itself. The Latin Mass is the thing that built holy, mighty Christendom, and not because of the holy priests, right? It's the Mass that matters. Never was it said, it's the priests that matter, right? No, it's the Mass that matters. This is the beautiful thing about authentic liturgy. It's not dependent on the personal holiness or on the personality of the priest, right? And so again, as I say with the Pope, it's not dependent on a Pope being a traditionalist before we will support this. Pope Benedict was not a traditionalist, and yet he liberated the Mass, and so all of a sudden you have this explosion of the traditional Catholic faith. You destroy the traditional Mass, and the reign of Antichrist is upon us. It's as simple as that. You restore the traditional Mass, and you're well on your way to restoring what? To restoring all things in Jesus Christ, and that's the point.
So do you think this has any ramifications politically?
Well, of course. The thing that stands between us and the New World Order is the traditional Latin Mass movement.
Yeah.
Because this is the Mass that was given to us by our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. He instituted this Mass. He instituted the priesthood, right? And he did so that we can survive whatever happens in the world, whatever the devil serves up, if we stay dedicated and faithful to the faith of our fathers, which the touchstone of which is the Latin Mass, then we will be able to, please God, withstand whatever comes. So the New World Order is the most diabolical anti-Christian movement possibly in history. And so you can see with the globalism and everything that's going on, the globalists are incredibly interested in what? In co-opting this town. The globalists cannot bring about their New World Order without a pope on their side, whether he's intentionally on their side or deluded, diabolically disoriented to serve their ends, which is what obviously we're all concerned about right now. But in any case, when you saw the push that they made to recruit Francis, I'm talking about Gates and Schwab and the whole World Economic Forum, Davos, get Francis in there, get Cardinal Turkson in there, right? To bless this diabolical New World Order. They know how important it is, and so they made every effort to do that. So I would say one of the reasons that the Great Reset, for example, at least has stumbled, we don't know if it's over, but one of the reasons it stumbled is because what was their number one weapon? It was COVID. COVID was their weapon. That's how Charles and Klaus Schwab and Gates and everybody else was going to, Biden, they were all going to lock down the world with COVID. Who broke from COVID most dramatically in public forum? Who was it? First, traditional Catholics. They said no, the Mass and Sacraments, that's essential. Porn shops and liquor stores, not so essential. The Mass and the Sacrament, the church is absolutely essential. So you had priests, as I've said so many times, go into the parking lot. In our case, we got a truck. The priest said Mass from the truck. Why? Because he wasn't about to let the globalist agenda crush the Mass, the traditional Latin Mass. Now that, in my opinion, could be, and sometimes we take heat from this, but it could be, this is where Francis felt embarrassment, because he had promised he was going to hand the Catholic Church over to their agenda. He was the first one. He stood right out here in the piazza. It was empty in dramatic fashion. He's out there. He masked himself up. He promoted the vaccines. And here are the traditional Catholics saying, not on your life. And after a while of COVID, that became the big story. The people who are resisting, there were Protestants that did it as well. Finally, there were some great, brave doctors. But the ones who really got out there as far as Francis is concerned were the traditional Latin Mass Catholics. And that was a problem. Why? Because we are not beholden to a New World Order. We're not beholden to a global government that's going to be the nanny state for us all. Just as similarly with synodality, we don't really need the church to listen to us on any other issue other than give us back the Mass of our fathers. That's it. And so we're not really playing that game, and they know it. And so they had to do something to break us up, to break these clans up, to undermine that automatic counter-revolution, which wasn't even thought through to any greater extent than we simply want to be faithful Catholics and we want to go to the Latin Mass. So yeah, I think the Latin Mass movement is hugely impactful on politics and poses a direct threat to the New World Order. For them, it must be frustrating because that Mass makes us not so much. We're confirmed soldiers of Jesus Christ. We have to die rather than deny the faith of our fathers, which means deny the Mass of our fathers, because it's the touchstone. So at our confirmation, we promised to die rather than deny an article of our faith, including the Latin Mass. But the thing is, which makes us a very slippery opponent for them, it's not so important. If you are faithful to the faith, if you're faithful to the traditional Latin Mass, if you understand why you're going to that Mass and what it all means, it's not that you're transformed into a crusader necessarily, although sometimes in the past that's happened. What it does is it transforms you into a saint. That's the idea. Sanctity is at the end of it, fully understanding and practicing your faith, the touchstone of which is the Latin Mass. And that's the big threat to the revolution. It's been the threat all along, that people will be so faithful to Catholicism, to the Church, to the faith that was handed down to us from the apostles, instituted by Jesus Christ to give grace, the sacraments, so faithful to that they would become saints. And sanctity, and that's why screaming and shouting and yelling may feel good, But a much more effective counter-revolutionary measure is, as I say, take a stand by getting on your knees at the Latin Mass. It's a very, very effective counter-revolutionary measure. And I think for many of these modernists, that's the biggest threat in the world today, is that there will be millions of us with our children on our knees at the traditional Latin Mass. That is counter-revolution.
So how does Leo come into all this for us?
Leo, okay, well, this is what was a little bit of a source of frustration for me. Nothing's really changed with Leo. We've been through it all. You know, we went through Paul VI, John Paul I, John Paul II, Benedict, Francis. Leo's just the latest, you know, and nothing changes from the point of view of the traditional Catholics. We only have one church. We only have one pope. But the Pope is not the head of the church. The Pope is not the head of the church. Jesus Christ is the head of the church. The Pope is merely his vicar. And so when it comes to like, for example, this weekend, I'm not asking for people to, put all your hope in Leo. I think that would be unrealistic. He was formed in the Novus Ordo. Right now, he's sort of marching to the globalist drumbeat, certainly to the synodal drumbeat. So the most important thing we can do for the Pope is we can pray for him, and we have to pray for him. And to pray for him is something, I had the opportunity to meet Cardinal Robert Serra just a couple days ago, quite providentially, right in the piazza here. And I thought it was really interesting. Well, let's just play the clip and I'll close on that. Say good morning. I'm from the United States of America. And I wanted to thank you for everything you're doing for the Latin Mass movement and so forth. I'm so grateful to you.
Pray for me, I will pray for you.
I will absolutely do so. God bless you. Thank you. What Cardinal Serra says there is so true. What we need is prayer. And this, I think, is a good way to just end this. I've probably gone on too long already. But only God can save us now. Cardinal Serra is a very holy man, and he knows that. Only God can save his church right now. And he will do this through the most powerful instrument in the church today, which is the traditional Latin Mass, the instrument that he himself instituted for our salvation. And that is the unbloody sacrifice of the altar, the Mass of our fathers. The thing that matters more than anything else is the Mass. So if we have the Mass, and we are try to be on the road to sanctity, and we pray for ourselves and for our children and for the church and for the Pope, at the end of the day, we emerge as the most powerful Catholic counter-revolutionaries on the face of the earth. And that's what we have to do.